Hello, I'm Neil Dymond-Green and I'm here to talk to you today about the Capability Brown Festival School and Family Resources Pack. I'm going to do it slightly out of order to the way that the pack was put together, because I think that actually if you're starting off with things, in some respects it's easier to start with families. So I'll be focusing on that part of the pack first. That's part 2 of the pack, followed by how to get started with schools, part 1 of the pack, before looking at the activity bank, which supports working with both types of audience. So as I said, I'm going to start with the working with families section of the pack first, which is part 2 of the pack. Page 2 of the pack outlines what you could term a spectrum of activities or activity types that you could do with families, right through from welcoming them and just simply doing that, which is a great start in itself, through to giving them something extra to do, and then through to different sort of drop-in activities or very specifically led activities. I would suggest that you start very much with the welcoming them, getting the basics ready, making sure that families know where they can get something to drink, something to eat, where the loos are, where they can park buggies, access to the site. The next stage from this really is basically to give families something very simple and straightforward to do, and it can be something as simple as something based around your map of your site if you've got one, or something like in part 3B of the activity bank there are all sorts of handouts and so on. So for instance on page 2 there's an autumn trail which you could very easily adapt, as this is a Word file, or there's a colour trail on page 3, or even a scavenger hunt on page 4. The idea being it's something very, very simple, straightforward that families can deal with, and there are no right or wrong answers with it, and that's a really great start for this sort of thing. If you have the resources and you're feeling a little bit more adventurous but don't want to do something that is too time intensive when families are actually there, then you could have a look at some sort of backpack type of setup. Families really like this sort of idea, and you can do it very cheaply and very simply. It's reasonable to get something like a hat, an explorer's hat of some sort, which again might fit with the theme of your house and your grounds, but could just be some sort of cheap explorer's hat. I'd recommend getting more than one for a bag, because obviously families quite often come with 2, 3, whatever children. You could also include things like a pair of children's binoculars, or even something like the innards of an old kitchen tube, or a poster tube, or something plastic for sort of children to look through, cellophane. The whole idea of obviously getting children to view things in different ways, just as Capability Brown had views and eye catches, that idea that you're drawn to things. You could have simple tree identification sheets. There's some examples of how to download them in the pack. It's obviously worth having just some drawing paper, pencils, coloured pencils, probably a clipboard actually is quite a useful thing, because obviously there's not so many good places outside to lean. The 2 things you do have to consider with backpacks, one are it's really important to keep things, like with any activities actually you're doing with family, but to keep things as simple and straightforward as possible. So any handouts or sheets or anything like that you put in, keep as simple and with as little actual reading on them as necessary. So it's something that's really intuitive and obvious for the children to do, but also it's something that parents can support them with without having to use too much brain power. The other thing to think about with backpacks is very much there is a bit of a time cost in terms of maintaining them, because obviously things will get a bit rough around the edges, worksheets will have been used and so on, so you will have to build in some time to make sure that you keep them up to date and tidy and representing your site really well. Another alternative for trails is to choose something. It could be a soft toy, it could be a picture that's somehow connected with your site, it could be a selection of clip art images that you laminate if you've got a laminator, or you put into plastic wallets and you actually just distribute them around the site and you ask families to go and find them. This could have a record sheet that goes with it, where perhaps at each stop there's a letter they've got to collect, which then makes up a whole word that spells out something connected with the site or with Capability Brown. or there could be answers to questions on them. So that might be another way of doing a trail that's semi-fixed. If you're beginning to feel a little bit more adventurous and you've got the staff or volunteer support to be able to do it, then something like a drop-in art activity or craft activity would be a nice option to go for next. There's a sample one on page 7 of the pack, but you could also have a look at some of the simpler art activities that are based in the activity bank to give you some ideas. And as I mentioned in the pack as well, Pinterest is a particularly good place. If you go to Pinterest, get yourself signed up and logged in, and then put in a search term for pretty much anything you're interested in, whether it's Christmas, Chinese New Year, summer, whatever. Someone will have come up with 101 different art and craft activities that you might as well beg, borrow and steal. The really key things to think about are keeping it as simple as possible. Part of keeping it simple is really thinking about what capability, pardon the pun, you have for actually dealing with family groups. How many do you really honestly think you're going to be able to cope with? And then whatever number you come up with, reduce that by at least 10 to 15%, because it's always busier than you think it's going to be. Don't be afraid to think outside the box in terms of what a family is going to look like when they turn up. You know, there may be grandparents, uncles, aunts, family, friends, and obviously there's some information in the owner's handbook as well about how to price that up, because I would strongly suggest, if you can manage to do it, not to charge any extra on top of the admission that they'll already have paid. Keep things straightforward, not too many resources, quite open-ended, but actually say to yourself, I'm only going to do it for an hour and a half, I'm going to do it for 2 hours, something like that. The next step beyond that is then to be leading something a little bit more defined. So it could be something like an interactive walk, and page 8 of the pack gives some suggestions out of the activity bank of sorts of things you might lead on that, or something that's a more led family session at your base, whatever room you've picked up on. So it could be something that's a bit more complex than an art or craft activity that works on a drop-in basis. I would strongly advise holding fire on either of those types of activity until you've really bedded down and got used to the levels that we've already talked about in terms of welcoming, simple trails, backpacks, drop-in activities, because it does take more time, it does take more resources. You do need to think more about staffing and volunteers for those. I'm not putting you off at all, and I think there's some really great stuff that you can be doing. If you feel you're ready to do something like a longer term booked family event, then I would certainly encourage you to do it. In terms of planning it, have a really good idea of a theme you want to do, or an outcome you want to produce. As it shows you on page 9 in the resource pack for this section, there's a logo in the activity bank that gives you ideas of some of the activities that would work better or not so well with families. Whatever you do, like with everything else I've said so far, don't try and overstretch. You've probably got some amazing activities and amazing ideas. Work out how you can pare it back, make it a bit simpler, and then on top of that, do the checklist on page 11, and always be prepared that more people will turn up than you've booked. No matter how many times you've booked, you'll get families who will bring, I can just have an extra child along, or whatever. You need to think in advance, and there's some hints on that about how you're going to deal with that. But honestly, the biggest and most important thing I would say about working with families is have fun with it. It shouldn't be too complicated, it shouldn't be too stressful. There will be stress, obviously, but it's actually something that you want the families to enjoy, but you also want you and any other staff and volunteers at your site to be able to enjoy as well. So, like I've said before, keep it as simple as you can, don't overstretch yourself, but really, actually enjoy it. And if you're not as comfortable with younger children and families, then think about how you're going to work with other volunteers and so on who will have those skills. Perhaps they may be former teachers and so on, but just think about how it's going to be really fun, and it's going to open up your site in a completely different way. Okay, Time now to think about working with schools and how you're going to get started with it. I'd strongly suggest, as in the structure of the pack, that you do give yourself a bit of time to think through and research before you get started. There are so many things that you need to... you won't get everything right, but you need to have good ideas in place. It's really key that you think about why you want schools to visit you. Now obviously you've got a fantastic site, you've got all the history, you've got all the landscape, but actually what is it that you're going to be able to offer schools that is special, that is extra? You're going to have some ideas about that, hopefully. It's also worth, if you can, trying to talk to teachers in local schools. You might have friends who are in or connected with education. It's really important to be quite open to some ideas about that. If you've got the chance to talk to other heritage sites, or even possibly sort of museums and galleries nearby, just to get an idea of why schools visit them, that might help frame your ideas as well. If you don't know anyone in a school, it's certainly worth trying to find out the name of the educational visits coordinator, or the deputy or assistant head teacher, or possibly the Key Stage 2 coordinator. Unfortunately, head teachers are generally not good contacts because they're actually just too busy to be able to deal with things. It's really important to think quite out of the box and quite broadly about what sort of activities and what sort of curriculum areas you might want to offer as options, because actually, as I mentioned on page 12 of this part of the pack, the period of Capability Brown being alive and doing all this brilliant work isn't covered in the school curriculum pretty much at all. But history curriculum does ask pupils to look at local history, which is might be a great one for local schools, but don't limit yourself to it. You've got a brilliant environment where you've got science going on, you've got possibilities for thinking about maths. If any real brilliant link can come out from Capability Brown, it's his design and technology approaches in terms of all the problems he had to deal with in terms of moving trees and creating hills and landscapes and whatnot, and obviously art and English as well. So some other things you need to think about in terms of practicalities before you start will be a basic risk assessment. Now, risk assessment sounds horrible, but it's pretty much walking around any parts of the site that you think you might use, working out what potential hazards there might be. You know, is there somewhere where people might trip or slip or whatever, and noting down just how you're going to try and avoid that risk, basically. There's a couple of examples linked to from the pack, and there's also a blank one in the support pack, so hopefully that isn't too difficult a thing to do. Part of that, you need to think about your public liability insurance as well. Another key thing to think about is child protection. It's obviously very key and central to working with schools and with children these days. At the very basic, what you need to make sure is that anybody from your site, whether it's you, staff, volunteers, or whatever, are not left alone with any visiting children without another adult from the school present. That's the very basic thing. Ideally, if you can organise for any people working with children to have a DBS check. This is basically the police check to make sure that there's no sort of reports on people and so on. That would be a good thing, because some schools will very specifically ask for that. Some schools are more relaxed about it. Alongside this, of course, is the whole issue of taking pictures, photos of children. And to be honest, as long as you're really careful, you're okay. Some things to think about is get consent from the school first. There's an example form in the pack. Try and take mainly photos from behind, so if you can take a photo of a group of children looking at the leader, for instance, and if you use them in any way on sort of websites or publicity, never ever use individual children's names. Now, it might sound like I'm going on about this a little bit, but actually this whole idea that preparation is key is going to make an actual visit from a school work better. So, for instance, one of the key things to think about is how long a visit do you actually want to offer. Schools might be pushing you to have them for a day. That's mainly because the cost of coaches these days is so ridiculously high that actually they'll want to get the best value out of that cost, because it won't cost it'll be very little difference whether they come for a full day or half day in terms of the cost of the coach. You don't have to lead them for the whole day, of course. There's no reason why, you're leading some activities, or somebody from your site is leading activities in the morning for a couple of hours or something, you couldn't then after lunch give them some activities. And there's a logo in the pack which says could be led by the teacher, so don't try and do it all yourself. Another thing to think about in terms of your prep is actually whether you're going to charge schools, how much you're going to charge them. Try not to charge for any usual price you might charge for admission to the site and then something, if you can manage to roll it into one thing. There's quite a useful sheet in the pack on page 7 which gives some ideas of the things you need to think about, to note down, to work out what you think the cost is, but it's really, really useful to actually talk to other sites near you and find out what they charge as well. A key thing to it, as I point out on page 6 in the pack, is don't charge for accompanying adults, because you actually need to have a good ratio of adults coming along. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, it's on page 6, but it's really important that schools don't feel that the cost of adults on top is going to put them off. I have mentioned this already, but actually I can't overstate the importance of trying to get volunteers involved. They can do some of the basic things like helping to set up and photocopy resources and support groups during activities, but actually you'll probably find that you'll know people who are interested in volunteering at your site who've already got experience of working with schools as teachers or whatever, and it would be a shame not to use their experience. It also takes some of the weight off your shoulders. It's certainly helpful if there's more than one person from the site that can be involved with the group, because then if something happens or there's some need for some extra resources, there's somebody there as a body that can rush off and sort that out. A last word on planning in advance would be to have a look at the pretty extensive practicalities checklist in the pack that's on pages 9 and 10. Hopefully that covers just about every possible eventuality, and it may be that some things on there you think that's not relevant to me, but hopefully it will give you a really good set of steps to think about before you actually decide to offer visits to schools. Something that's worth also thinking about in advance is the age group you want to aim for. Now, the resources that have been produced are primarily for Key Stage 2. This is children in what used to be called juniors, that part of primary school, so we're talking 7 to 11 year olds. The grid on page 11 in the pack really gives you a good idea of where things different fit in, and it's also worth, I'm not suggesting you try and learn it all off by heart, but it's worth being aware of the fact that there are the national curriculum, religious education, sex and relationship education, and from the online version of the pack, or the digital version, there are links to actually go and have a look at those. Don't try and steep yourself too much in it. It's just useful to have a good sense, an overall sense I should say, of the sort of subjects and areas that are taught. It finally feels like we're getting to the stage where we can actually plan the actual visit and the activities, which is really exciting. Think about the practical elements, all the things like hanging up coats, toilet breaks, snack breaks, lunch breaks. They all are things that are worth having in place. I'm sorry, I know it sounds like I'm going on about plan, but being prepared, it really does take a lot of the stress out of things. The other key thing to think about is whatever activities you do, you or whoever's leading the activities, it doesn't have to be a full-on expert, it doesn't have to be somebody that talks all the time. It's really, really educationally sound and very useful to keep in mind what Benjamin Franklin said: tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. So as much as you can, where you can get the children to be discussing things themselves, working in pairs and groups, and having time to think about things themselves and not just being told stuff, the much better any learning will be that comes out of your activities that you've planned. Another thing that's really important to remember is help the children to engage all their senses. I've particularly recommended things like this silent walk and remove a sense activities from the activity bank, but anything where they're not just using their eyes, but they're listening, they're smelling, they're touching. These things are going to really, really engage their education, really engage their faculties, help them to actually remember the day. Now, I'm going to talk more about the activity bank in a moment, but just in general terms, when you're starting out, have a look at the really simple activities in the pack. There's a code. The number of trees indicates the level of complexity and the amount of resources that are needed. Page 15 gives you a mini index into the activity bank, where it's the simplest activities, mainly fairly short, and that's fine. You can string several ones together. And as I've mentioned before, you don't have to do everything. So if there are activities that you want to hand over to the teacher for part of the day, if they come for a whole day, or part of a morning, whatever, really, really consider it. When you do come to have a look at planning and picking things from the activity bank, it's very much meant to be a pick and mix approach rather than set lessons, set sessions. It's the things that appeal to you, it's the things that meet your site's needs and play on your site's strengths. That said, in the pack on pages 16 and 17 of part 1, there are some example possible itineraries. These might help you. You might want to throw them away and actually try your own and put them together. They're just there to give you a little bit of an idea. So please be creative, please make it work for you. That's the whole point of this resource. There's quite a useful checklist on page 19 in the pack as well, which are the things that you need to organise with the school and to have thought about with the school. Some of them you might not manage to meet. So for instance, one that says, have you invited the teacher to visit your site to do their own risk assessment? It's quite possible teachers won't come do it. They should, but they may not. But the idea is that the more of that you've managed to meet, and there are pointers on it on the pages around there, the better chance you've got of everything flowing smoothly on the day. It's really quite helpful as well to keep records of visits as you start doing them. You might think at the start, I'm only ever going to have a couple of schools in, but actually keep records, set up a simple spreadsheet or something. There's an example one that can be downloaded, and keep records, because then if you have schools coming again, you'll know what it is you did and what you talked to them about previously. Some key things to think about actually when the school's there on the day is it's really important to be planned and prepared, like I said, but it's also really important to be flexible. Schools will often arrive late, they'll arrive early, they won't have the right number of adults, something will not be quite right with what you've expected. So have some reserve plans up your sleeve, have an extra short activity or game up your sleeve just in case something finishes quicker or they arrive early. Maybe think about little things like making the teachers more comfortable by at the beginning or the end of the session or at a break point giving them some simple refreshments. Like I mentioned before, think about all the practicalities about the hanging up coats and bags, but use that time as well as an opportunity to have another chat with the teacher. Just double check at that point that they're expecting the same thing as you, because you might have spoken to a different teacher in the school and it's quite difficult if they're expecting something that you're not expecting to give them. Do watch out as well with some of the adults, especially adult helpers, but sometimes teachers, that while you're trying to lead activities or somebody from your site, they may do one of two things. They may try and disappear off because they think that you're in charge. Well, actually, they're in charge. Or they might start nattering, and it's actually fine to say to them, I'm really sorry, but this is actually disturbing me working with the children. They'll soon stop, don't worry. One last thing to think about for the day, and obviously you can do some preparation for this in advance, but you may end up doing some of it while you're with the group, is getting feedback from both the adults and the children that are involved. There are some example suggestions on page 22 of this part of the pack. Also in part 1b, which is the Microsoft Word element that has all the editable forms and things that you're going to need. Right at the back of that section there is a feedback form that you could use with teachers, and there's actually an activity sheet that you could use with pupils as well. You don't have to, you might find a better way of doing it, but the really important thing is to use it as a learning experience for yourself as well. You're almost guaranteed that things will not go exactly to plan, and even if they did go exactly to plan, you may pick up from something that pupils say, something that the adults say to the pupils or to you, that there's something you could make even better another time. And the ideal situation is that all round, if you get that school coming back another time, even though they might do different activities, you're going to be thinking, oh yeah, actually, I learnt this from what they did last time, I can make the experience even better, and hopefully easier for yourself as well. And now we come to the activity bank. Now this activity bank is meant for, particularly for pupils at Key Stage 2 and with families. So in terms of the way that it's been structured, as I mentioned earlier, it's very much pick and mix set of activities, and I'm not going to go through every single activity in it. Page 2 gives you a reminder that they are graded in terms of how easy they are to lead and how much in the way of resources they need, going from 1 to 3 trees. Page 3 points out that there are activities in here, as I mentioned before, that could be led by the teacher, so it could be something you can hand over to the teacher to do, give the instructions and possibly a handout sheet. And also it gives information about how suitable or how adaptable activities are for families. In addition to this, we've tried very hard to make sure that as far as possible activities have some adaptability elements, so for groups where there are less able or younger pupils, or more able or older pupils, the idea that you can ramp the activity up a bit or down a bit to hopefully make this a bit more flexible. The activities have been indexed not only by level of complexity but also by curriculum areas, so if there's particular areas that teachers are interested in, don't just be led by the teacher, but certainly that might be helpful. Then it's useful to be able to actually look and go, oh, these ones fit under particular curriculum areas. Before just talking a bit more about the general activities that are in here, a couple of pointers. It's page 6 and page 7 of Activity Bank. One of them is about how important it is to think about the sorts of questions you use. It's very, very easy. We've all done it if we've talked to people, let alone talked to children, to ask what are called closed questions. Closed questions are ones that have very limited sort of answer, so they might have a yes/no answer or just a very short factual answer. They can have their place, but actually sometimes they end up being the questions you ask where you've got an idea in your head, and the children end up playing a guessing game trying to work out what it is you want them to say. And actually really what you want to be doing with questions is asking more open questions, questions that encourage them to think about the whys and the hows and how you might explain the way that Capability Brown worked, for instance. So don't limit yourself and don't limit the pupils by the sorts of questions you ask. As well as this, there's some pointers on page 7 around ways of including everyone. I speak as experience as someone who was very shy and quiet when I was a child. I would never put my hand up if I could get away with it. So some ideas around getting children to work in pairs and in small groups and sending different envoys off to each other and so on are a really nice way of making sure that out of a group everyone gets a chance to speak or to share an idea with someone, even if they don't want to say it to the whole class. And that's another really important learning thing. I'm not going to talk through every activity in the activity bank because it would probably just do your head in, to be honest. I'm going to talk about some general things that come up. So if you look at the first few activities, so from page 9 on to page 16, these are all simple, quite short activities, 5, 10, 15 minutes at the most, that don't need a lot of resources. There are a few resources for them, mainly paper, pencils and clipboards. But ones that you could very easily do just to get children going, or to plug a gap if you're a bit short on an activity, or to link things together. The last two activities in this section, the treasure hunt and the orienteering, pages 17 and 19, would take a little bit more setup, but again they're fairly simple, fairly accessible, and I would say that pretty much every activity in this section would be very easily adaptable for working with families or with younger and older pupils as well, so they're quite flexible. The next section of activities are very much to do with exploring the landscape, Again, they start with a couple of fairly easy, fairly straightforward activities. One that's the picture frame, one that's about thinking about views, as Capability Brown would have been thinking about. Identifying different elements in the landscape, again very much a Brown related thing, and that also has a worksheet that handout that goes with it. There's another one that thinks about seasons in the landscape, because obviously unless children are doing repeat visits, they're only going to see it one point of the year, and to actually imagine what it's going to be like when there's snow or no leaves on the trees and so on is quite an interesting, useful art and science related activity. You start getting into some that are a little bit more complex, but not too bad, around the Keeping Nature Natural, which uses some very, very basic drama skills. You've then got a couple of maths related activities. The first one's a very simple one that needs very little in the way of resources and could be done very easily, could work with possibly with families as well. The second one is much more reliant on school bringing particular different sort of ways of measuring activities and so on, but it isn't a difficult one, it's just a different way of a different context for them working with maths. Theatre in the Garden is again relating to the idea of Brown's viewpoints being dramatic, but you do need with that one to be a little bit more confident about the idea of directing children to use some very, very simple drama techniques. I wouldn't even use the word drama with the kids, to be honest. It's big statues that are adopting different poses and thinking about things. Nice activity around art and craft, around using found materials. What can you make from finding twigs, leaves, cones, whatever it is that you pick up. The next two activities, Landscape Poems and Capability Brown's punctuation marks, are a little bit more sophisticated. They're trying to link into the use of English and the use of punctuation and words in English. I wouldn't advise rushing into those until you've done some more of the basic ones, but I think they're very, very useful ways of getting children to engage their senses, and they're moving around the landscape and making connections with it. The last one in this section, Investigating the Landscape, does rely more on you having some older maps or plans or pictures of your site, ideally both before and after. Also definitely better for the older end of primary, maybe even into secondary school. Nice little activity. It's very much about trying to investigate, are there clues to what the landscape might used to look like. And now here's the science. Well, okay. The next section is around living things. Some of these will need a little bit more setup and thoughts. You've got the tree hunt one, which would be around tree identification or leaf shape drawing. That's quite an easy one to do, and there's some example sheets you can download to go with that one. The How a Tree Works one, again I've snuck in a slightly drama based one, but actually it's a nice little activity which really gets children thinking about how the different parts of a tree work. Ideally best if you can do it on some dry ground somewhere or inside, but it looks complicated. It's actually very, very simple to put together and well worth doing. Mini beast hunts and thinking about homes that mini beasts and so on might look for very, very much tie into the younger end of primary curriculum. For the mini beast hunt, you will need to have some more resources, or ask the school to bring them, because actually obviously catching the mini beasts takes different little bug catchers and things. Pond dipping activity, you need to have a little bit more of a definite setup with some really good access and some really carefully prepared place for the children to do pond dipping. It's an activity that kids will love, but obviously the risks are a little bit higher with you being at the edge of water. So again, I would hold back on that one until you've got more experience of doing other simpler activities. The food chains activity, which is the last one in this section, again, it's one that looks slightly complicated, but actually it's fairly straightforward. It's one that potentially you could just give to the teacher to do with the pupils after they've done some other simpler activities with you. The next section of activities is all around Mr. Brown and his capabilities. We couldn't leave him out, obviously, although he's had a bit of a look in earlier. So it's starting to think much more about what's very specifically Capability Brown about your landscapes. First activity, super nice, easy one. ties in with the idea that we talked about before about Mr. Brown creating views using eye catchers, and it's getting to think about, again, a little bit like some of the other activities earlier, about what are the different elements of a Brown landscape rather than just a general landscape. The next few activities are very much around design and technology skills, and also children's creative responses, which hopefully makes sense in terms of linking in with how Capability Brown will have had to have come up with some remarkably creative and inventive responses to things. So you've got Water, Water Everywhere, which is all around different ways of getting water to stay in a place to create a lake. How do you move a tree, which links in to the idea of Brown's tree moving machine, and there's actually a picture of that in the worksheet pack. But it's about children coming up with their own ideas how they're going to move this huge great tree when they don't have modern resources like power tools, diggers and tractors and so on. And then you've got Changing What You See, which is about borrowing views and changing views again and so on. And again, that's very much a kind of relating into the history of the place, but also thinking art-wise and creatively as well. How do you make the land useful on page 45 is also another of these activities requesting a creative response, because it's this idea of balancing up the land still being useful but also looking good for the landowners. It's actually another quite simple one to do, and it's again about handing the ideas over to children. So like I mentioned earlier in this webinar, the idea being that you don't try and tell them too much, you try and get them to come up with what answers you think there might have been. The next activity, Keeping the Gardeners Happy, is kind of an interesting one in terms of thinking about how the land change. If your site previously had formal gardens where some of the landscape is now, for instance, there would have been gardeners who would have worked with that, and they would have had to have actually dealt with those changes, and it's getting the children to put themselves in the shoes of people in the past and how they would respond, and how they maybe get to do a little protest or something about Capability Brown ripping up all their hard work, because you can imagine it would be quite challenging if you had worked on a great garden like that and suddenly discovered that actually it was going to be taken away. Now, I really like the next activity, Not My Home, but I would be the first to say it's not one that you would want to throw yourself into in early stages or maybe even middling stages of working with pupils. This might even be one to give to teachers to use as a follow-on activity. What's great about it for me is that it is very much, again, like the Keeping the Gardeners Happy, about taking on the understanding of somebody in the past, and actually trying to understand their feelings and their point of view about the changes that Capability Brown made, and then presenting them to Capability Brown. And I do quite like this idea that maybe he changes his mind about some of the things he did. You'll notice if I skip an activity as well that Capability Brown Visionary or Vandal, page 49, is again a more complex one. Again, it's around debate, and it's using information that they're given in the information cards in the worksheet pack. They have to actually adopt a position. Was Brown great, or was he actually quite destructive in what he did? So that activity, and the one on page 48, Who Was Lancelot Brown, and probably as well Not My Home, are possible things that you could actually give the instructions and the relevant copies of the information sheets to teachers to do, either as an activity that they could lead on site, or more likely actually back in school as a follow-on. Just a quick finish off to say that you've got part 3B, which is a set of handouts that relate to activities in the main activity bank, and because they're in Word format, there's no reason why quite a few of those you couldn't change and adapt, especially some of the trails and things early on. But it was obviously produced in that format so that it was accessible and adaptable for you or for schools. When you get to the stage way down the line, I'm sure, but that's fine, that you might want to think about working with different age groups, part 4 gives some hints about just some basic approaches to use, not really activities, but some of the areas that they might be covering in the curricula, and how you might be able to tie into those. Again, like with setting up for any school's work, it's really going to be important for you to have a dialogue with teachers in the school that are hopefully going to organise a visit. Recognise that you're probably not even going to want to look at part 4 for a while unless you've been doing school groups for. That's fine. It's there as a good backup for when you're ready. Well, it only remains for me to say that I hope that you find the resource pack as useful as possible. Hope it's suitably varied and adaptable. Hope it gives you all that sort of information to get yourself started, but also as you develop on your road of having schools and families visit, that it will be something that will grow with you and that you'll be able to continue to use. It was a pleasure to work on it, and it's been a pleasure to be part of Capability Brown Festival, and I wish you and your site every success with your schools and families work. Thank you for your time.